Hey everyone, Sam here, thanks for joining me. In this video I'm going to show you how to paint turquoise blue ocean and give you some tips on painting seascapes in general. Now I'm going to demonstrate this with my latest seascape painting, which actually proved to be a bit of a challenge because I ran into some problems with the composition as I was painting it. Now this partly could have been avoided had I done some better planning, but sometimes it's the case that as you're painting an artwork you run into some problems with it, especially with the composition. So I'm going to show you as well in this video how you can identify some of these compositional errors and how you can fix them. Now if you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. In the meantime, sit back and enjoy the video. This painting is inspired by the Central Coast area in Australia. It's about a couple of hours drive north of Sydney, and the whole area is characterised by this stunning coastline and this beautiful turquoise blue ocean. There's some really nice golden sandy beaches here as well, and there's lots of inspiration for seascape paintings. So here I'm painting on a 12-inch by 16-inch linen stretcher, and I've toned the linen surface with a wash of burnt sienna, and this just helps to warm up the painting as it comes through the paint layers. There's something really nice about painting on this burnt sienna surface, as the colours leap out at you the moment that you apply the paint to the canvas. I sketch out my composition using a No. 1 round brush and burnt sienna mixed with liquid, and I'm using liquid to improve the flow of the paint, and it also has the added advantage that it speeds up the drying time. This is very useful because I'm using oil paint, and it often means that the paint is touch dry within 24 hours. Now as I sketch out the composition, I'll go over the colours I'm using, which includes titanium white, burnt sienna, yellow oxide, but you could also use yellow ochre as well, quinacridone magenta, ultramarine blue, cobalt blue, cobalt teal and phthalo green. The brushes I'm using include a No. 5 and No. 2 flat brush, a No. 3 filbert brush, a No. 1, 0 and 00 round brushes, and this includes a mix of bristle and synthetic rounds, and I'm also using a 3/8 of an inch and 1/4 inch dagger brush, and again I'm using a mix of synthetic and bristle dagger brushes. So once I've sketched out my composition, the first thing I think about is values, and values is how light or dark a subject is. And I have found that it's easiest to paint your darks first because this sets the tonal dynamic for the whole painting, and then once you've got your shadows and dark values in, it makes it much easier to add those areas in light afterwards. And this is something I learnt from some other artists when painting outdoors on plein air, because the advantage of painting your shadows first is that it doesn't matter that the sunlight changes. And I found that this was just as useful applying it to my studio work, so I've done this ever since. So dark values and shadows first, and the first thing I start off with is the furthest zone away in the painting, and that's the sky, so I begin with those cloud shadows. Now skies and clouds are generally some of the lightest values you'll find in the landscape, obviously with the exception of stormy clouds. But this is going to be the lightest of the shadows in this painting. So I start the cloud shadows with a mix of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, and I love these two colours. They're probably the two most useful colours on my palette. The burnt sienna is actually a dark orange, so it combines really well with ultramarine blue, as orange being opposite to blue on the colour wheel. When the two are combined, they cancel each other out, so it means we can create black with those two colours, or a colour near to that. But when we mix in titanium white, which is also what I've done here, we can create some really nice natural looking greys. These are definitely my two go-to colours on my palette. So once I've painted in those cloud shadows, I then move to the other major dark zones in the painting, and that's those rocks in the foreground. Now the reason they're so dark is because this is where we'll find our darkest tones. here in the foreground. Whereas when landforms recede into the distance, darks are not so dark and lights are not so light. This is because the value scale narrows. So here I've mainly used a mix of ultramarine blue with burnt sienna. I even mixed in a little bit of yellow oxide as well, and I've used a small amount of titanium white. So now I've established the two major zones of shadow, the cloud shadows and the rock shadows. And I'm going to return to the sky and start painting some of those cloud highlights. And what I've done here is I've mixed titanium white with some burnt sienna. And that burnt sienna in the white helps those clouds to sit back in the landscape, but it also gives those cloud highlights a nice orange glow to it. And because I've been using titanium white and burnt sienna in my cloud shadow mix, they're going to combine really nicely. So it also means I can blend in some of those highlights with the shadows. Now after that I paint the sky, and this is a mix of ultramarine blue, a little cobalt blue, cobalt teal which I've used more nearer to the horizon, and titanium white. And I keep in mind that the value of that sky is quite light. Now at this stage I'm using larger brushes, number 5 flat brushes, because I want to create some loose painterly brushwork that's going to come through the painting later on when I build up detail on top of it. So it just helps to give the painting an aliveness to it. I have a general kind of rule with my paintings, and that's loose brushwork to start with and then end the painting with finer details. Once I've finished with the sky, the next major zone in the painting is the sea. And there's lots going on here. We've got the ocean swells in the background and then breaking waves and white water in the foreground. Now for the main body of the ocean, I've actually used only a few colours but then used them in varying amounts. So for the sea that's in the midground and the background, I've mixed ultramarine blue with some cobalt teal, titanium white and some phthalo green. And then as I've come towards the foreground, I've then started introducing yellow oxide and more titanium white, and this just increases the value of the colour, so makes it lighter. But then also the yellow oxide is warming up that mixture. Now the cobalt teal, which is a kind of turquoise blue colour, as well as the phthalo green, is what's going to give us that nice emerald colour in the ocean here. If you find the greens running away with you a bit too much, you can knock it back with some more ultramarine blue. Now one of the main things to note in this seascape is the wave is front lit, which means the sun is shining on the wave. And actually, majority of seascape paintings that I've seen are painted where the light's coming from behind the wave, so it's backlit. And this does make waves easier to paint because you've got that sharp contrast between the main body of the breaking wave, which is in shadow, and then suddenly you've got this highlight on top. Whenever you paint front lit waves, there is more of a risk that they can look flat, but that's not a reason not to paint them. If we're going to paint these types of seascapes, then we need to introduce some other elements in there that are casting shadows to add to the realism of the scene. So in this seascape, I've got the rocks on the right side of the painting which are casting a shadow in the water. I mix these shadows with ultramarine blue, a little burnt sienna and titanium white. And I need to keep in mind that this colour needs to be darker in value than the surrounding ocean that's in the full sunlight, but needs to be much lighter than those rocks. Once I've marked that in, I then work on that rock shelf that's in the full sunlight. And I'm keeping the mixtures simple and mainly using my earth colours, which include burnt sienna, yellow oxide, a little ultramarine blue, which I use to take the saturation out of the colour, and then titanium white, which I also use to get the value that I want. It also helps to desaturate the colour as well. We've got a few different rock tones here, so I don't mix those colours thoroughly. But then I also blend them into that sea mix that I've just painted a moment ago. I then afterwards mark in a few shadows, not that there's that many in those rocks there, but it just helps to add more definition to those rocks and mark out some zones that I can work with later on in the painting when I start adding details. Now once I've worked on this area, I then start painting the areas of foam within the sea, so that blanket of foam that's coming off the breaking wave as it's barreling over, and then those foam patterns in the foreground. Now, this stage of the painting, the last thing I want to do is use pure titanium white from the tube, because otherwise it leaves me no room to add any kind of detail to it. If it's tonally the same colour, it's just going to look flat, so I make it darker by mixing in some ultramarine blue and a little burnt sienna. And then what I'll do is throughout the painting, when I start adding more detail to the foam patterns and the white water and the breaking wave, then I'll start adding lighter layers to it. I'll be saving my lightest values until the very end of the painting, and this is where I'll pretty much be using titanium white with a little bit of yellow oxide mixed in there to warm up the colour. So here I'm just applying the paint with a 3/8 of an inch bristle dagger brush. And these are great for painting seascapes because you can use the broad end for painting the barreling breaking wave, for example, and even use it for painting sea spray, but then you can use the tip for painting finer detail as well. Now, once I'd finished painting the foam and white water in the foreground, I then just tidied up the whole painting, just adding as much information as I can that's going to make it easier for me when I start adding the details. Now, when I block in a painting, I try and do it in one sitting because it's at this point I can see if the colours and the tonal dynamic is going to work. I always leave my paintings at this stage tonally a bit darker so that I've still got plenty of room to add my lighter values as I start building up the details. So here I left it to dry and then I came back to it a few days later. Now, when I came back to it after it was dry, I'd spotted a major problem with the composition, and it was partly my fault because really what I should have done was a colour study. Now, I did do a sketch for this painting to design the composition in the first place, which is something I always do if I'm going to do a studio painting. But the canvas size is one of those sizes where it's kind of medium size and you could probably in most cases get away with not having to do a colour study, but sometimes it can catch you out, and it did in this case. Now, the major issue that was going on here is that rock on the right side of the painting was exactly parallel with the rocks behind it, and it was also cluttering the composition and leading the eye off to the right side of the painting. So this urgently needed changing. So what I did was I actually took a photo of my painting and used a program that's similar to Photoshop, but something that I found that was free on the internet. I wasn't that good at using it, but it was enough that I could change the shape of that rock to see what it would look like. And I was able to actually find some rock reference from the same location that was a much better fit, so it was actually an easy fix. But this is a problem I could have picked up if I'd have done a colour study first. But anyway, not a problem. I just remarked where the rocks were going to go and then went back to the furthest zone in the painting, which is the sky, and started building up the detail within the clouds. After working on the sky, it was back to the sea again, and I'm using the same colours but this time just adding more details. Now, I was able to use that sea mix to start filling in the negative spaces around the newly outlined rock on the right side of the painting, so I was quickly remedying the problem here. I was also bringing the water forward in the painting so that there was less of those rocks, because I just wanted to create a space within the foreground. I then spent some time working on the rocks on the right side of the painting, keeping in mind that those are dark values that I'm using there. I'm still continuing to use a mix of mostly ultramarine blue with burnt sienna and titanium white. I've also used a little bit of quinacridone magenta in the mix as well. I've marked in where the cracks and fissures are in the rocks and then worked around them. After that, I was then able to repaint the rock that's on the right side of the painting in the foreground. Now at this point I've got a good solid base of my sea colour that I've mixed, and the colours I've been using for the sea here and throughout the painting is varying mixes of ultramarine blue, cobalt teal, phthalo green, titanium white and yellow oxide, and I use the yellow oxide to warm up the sea and make it more green. Be careful not to use too much phthalo green because it can very easily overpower your mixture. It's a strong colour. But anyway, that's all sorted, and now I'm going to build up more texture and detail within those foam patterns. these are going to be the lightest values in the painting. The foam patterns are also going to help with the composition by leading the eye subtly towards the breaking wave, which is the main focal area of the painting. So when painting seascapes, use these things to your advantage. I'm using mainly titanium white, but I'm still mixing in some ultramarine blue and burnt sienna to make the value a little darker. However, this layer is lighter than the layer I applied during the blocking in stage. So I'm slowly increasing the value of these colours, which is going to add to the realism of this zone in the painting. Now, as I spend time adding more detail to that rock shelf that's in the foreground, my brushes are getting smaller, and here I've been mainly using number 3 filbert brushes. And filbert brushes are very versatile because you can use the flat end of the brush for broad gestural brush marks, but then the rounded edge also allows you to create finer marks. So from this point there was more detail added to the rocks, and then I allowed the painting to dry again so that I could then add another layer to the foam patterns and white water in the foreground. Of course I'm using titanium white, but I still mix in a little bit of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna because I still want the value a little darker. And here I'm using 1/4 inch synthetic dagger brushes. These brushes are great for seascapes because the synthetic hairs hold their shape much better than the bristle brushes do. So it means you can get some really nice fine marks and edges with them. These are perfect for painting foam patterns because you can use the broad edge of the brush and then also the tip of the brush for some really fine details. At this point in the painting, I allowed it to dry again so that I could start refining it and ultimately preparing it so I can add those final details, which is just going to bring the whole thing together and make it come alive. So there were some things to finish up in the sky, and again I was using the same colours that I've been using during the blocking in stage and the second pass that I carried out with the sky. I've been keeping the colours simple, and it's really just been mostly ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, titanium white for the clouds, and that includes the cloud highlights. And then for the sky itself, ultramarine blue, a little cobalt blue, cobalt teal and titanium white. By using fewer colours in the sky, it's going to look a lot cleaner. I had further layers to the white water and the blanket of foam that's in the sea in the foreground, and then I start painting some reflected light in the side of those rocks on the right, and that reflected light is going to communicate wet looking rocks. And I'm starting to use much smaller brushes here, using a number 0 synthetic round brush which has got a nice fine point to it. Now as I'm getting towards the end of the painting and as the detail increases, the brushes are getting smaller. Now adding a few subtle areas of reflected light in the rocks is going to go a long way to communicating the rough jagged surfaces and pockmarked areas of these rocks. I let the painting dry again, and it was now time to add the final details, and this is where I'll be adding my lightest values in the painting, which are of course those foam patterns and the blanket of foam from the breaking wave. So this is where I'm using titanium white with a little bit of yellow oxide just to warm it up. I use a bristle dagger brush for the main area of the foam from the breaking wave, and then I'm using a much smaller number 0 round brush and just selectively applying a few highlights to the white water and foam in the foreground. Now I thought I'd finish this painting, and then I was looking at it in the studio for a few days, and then I was like, oh no, I've spotted another problem with it again. I'd gotten so engrossed in my painting that I didn't realise that I'd made a load of aberrations in the white water in the foreground, and there was a load of repeating shapes there in the foam patterns. Luckily it was an easy fix though, and what I did was I mixed up the same colours that I'd used before for the sea and the rocks, and I just broke up those lines, and then once I'd done that I repainted some of those foam patterns to make it look a lot more random. Now I've found that when I've painted studio paintings, especially when they're larger paintings and you're spending several weeks working on them, that you can get quite engrossed in what you're doing, and without realizing it you can create aberrations or errors in your composition and you don't see them straight away. So quite often when I'm painting and I've just finished on a session working on it, I'll leave it for a couple of days or even longer and just have a look at it, because you quite often don't see the problem straight away. It's even also worth getting someone else to have a look at your painting as well, because they might be able to see problems that you might not necessarily have been able to see in yourself. Now if you do see a problem in your painting, don't panic, because most of the time they're nearly always fixable. And if you're using oil paint or acrylic, you can always wait for your painting to dry and then just paint over the problem. If it's a major error, then you may need to return to your sketchbook and redesign the composition, or use something like Photoshop to play around with a design. So anyway, I got this painting fixed in the end and I was happy with it. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And also feel free to leave me a comment in the comments section below. Now if you'd like to learn more about painting, then check out the painting resources I have on my website at samuelerp.com. I've got lots of free written painting tutorials which you're welcome to copy and use the reference photos that I've provided. And I also have full-length painting tutorial videos for sale from my website. Now you can also get instant access to all of those painting tutorial videos by subscribing to me on Patreon for just $5 a month. As I say, you get instant access to all of my full-length painting tutorial videos and a new painting tutorial video every month. If you'd like to see the paintings I'm working on at the moment, then you can follow me on Instagram and Facebook, and I update these sites regularly. And I've posted all the links to the sites I've just mentioned in the description box below. Thanks for watching, and I shall see you in the next video.